June 6, 1944. At dawn, over 156,000 Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy. By the end of the day, thousands of German defenders were either dead, captured, or retreating. But what most of those captured men never expected was not the shock of defeat, but what came after. Because instead of starvation, disease, and brutal captivity, tens of thousands of German prisoners of war would find themselves on ships bound for a land they had only seen in propaganda posters: the United States. And when they arrived, they were stunned, not by American weapons, but by America's staggering industrial power. Before we dive deeper, write in the comments, where are you watching from? Which state or country? And what time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating to see the world come together here. And now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The story of German POWs in America is one of the least discussed yet most revealing aspects of World War II. Between 1942 and 1946, over 425,000 German prisoners were shipped across the Atlantic to the United States. They were dispersed into more than 700 camps across 46 states. This decision wasn't made lightly. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment of prisoners, but the logistics were staggering. America had to feed, house, and control nearly 500,000 men, many of them seasoned Wehrmacht veterans. The first shock came at the ports. German prisoners arriving in New York, Boston, or Norfolk expected humiliation, perhaps even revenge from civilians whose sons had been killed in Europe. Instead, they were met with orderly processing, medical examinations, and surprisingly well-organized transportation. Historian Arnold Kramer, in his groundbreaking study, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, notes that German officers were bewildered by the efficiency. One prisoner later recalled, "We thought we would be paraded like animals. Instead, they gave us clean clothes, food, and cigarettes." Cigarettes, in fact, became the first symbol of America's industrial might. By 1943, the US was producing over 300 billion cigarettes annually. In Germany, rationing and shortages meant tobacco was scarce. For a soldier who had just crossed the Atlantic in defeat, being handed an American pack of Lucky Strikes was an almost surreal experience. It wasn't just generosity, it was a demonstration of economic superiority. Once in camps, the second shock followed: the food. According to US Army records, POWs received the same rations as American soldiers, sometimes even better. A standard meal could include meat, bread, butter, coffee, and fruit. Compare this to Germany in 1944, where civilians were receiving fewer than 1,500 calories per day in some cities. In letters later examined by the US Office of Censorship, prisoners described their meals with astonishment. One wrote, "If this is captivity, then perhaps it is better than freedom in the Reich." But the greatest astonishment came not from food or cigarettes, but from work. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be required to perform non-military labor. The US seized this opportunity. By 1944, labor shortages gripped the American home front as millions of men served overseas. German POWs were deployed as farmhands, lumber workers, and factory laborers. They harvested cotton in Texas, picked fruit in California, and cut timber in the Midwest. It was here, in America's fields and factories, that German prisoners confronted the raw scale of American industrial power. In Germany, the propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels had depicted the United States as weak, decadent, and racially divided. They were told America could not sustain a long war. But on the ground, prisoners saw vast mechanized farms stretching for miles, tractors larger than any they had seen in Europe, and endless supplies of fuel. Historian Robert Doyle, in The Enemy in Our Hands, recounts the testimony of one prisoner who worked in Kansas. We could not believe the number of machines. One farmer had more tractors than an entire village in Bavaria. Another POW, assigned to a sawmill in Minnesota, wrote that he had never seen lumber processed so quickly. In Germany, 10 men would take a day to cut what one American machine did in an hour. The numbers backed up these impressions. By 1944, American factories were producing 96,000 aircraft per year, 57,000 tanks, and 28,000 ships. The scale dwarfed Germany's production, even at its peak under Albert Speer. For the prisoners, these statistics weren't abstract. They were visible every day. Trains hauling steel, convoys of trucks on highways, warehouses filled with food and clothing. Even the camps themselves became a lesson in abundance. Each camp had a canteen where prisoners could purchase goods with coupons earned from labor. Items included chocolate, soda, and toiletries, luxuries unimaginable in wartime Europe. A declassified report from the Office of War Information in 1945 noted that German POWs were sending censored letters home that often praised American conditions, despite their captors' attempts to limit morale-boosting messages. But it wasn't just abundance, it was freedom. Within camp boundaries, prisoners organized orchestras, built theaters, and staged soccer tournaments. In Camp Swift, Texas, over 2,000 prisoners watched plays written and performed by their fellow inmates. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, POWs painted murals and published camp newspapers. The contrast with Allied POWs in German camps like Stalag Luft Thur, where food shortages, harsh punishments, and death were daily realities, was staggering. This disparity was not lost on the German prisoners. They began to ask themselves dangerous questions. If America could feed, clothe, and house hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers in relative comfort, while Germany could not feed its own civilians, what did that say about the Reich's future? Yet not all prisoners were willing to acknowledge this reality. Hardcore Nazis within the camps attempted to maintain ideological control. They formed secret cells, enforced discipline, and sometimes attacked fellow prisoners who showed signs of admiration for America. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, in November 1943, German POWs murdered fellow prisoner Johannes Kunze, whom they suspected of being an informant. The incident shocked the American public and revealed that Nazi ideology remained alive, even behind barbed wire. Nevertheless, the overall effect was undeniable. Exposure to America's industrial might shattered many illusions. By 1945, US intelligence units noted a shift in prisoner attitudes. Interrogations revealed growing disillusionment with Hitler and the Nazi leadership. Historian Stephen Ambrose observed that many POWs, upon repatriation, carried back not just memories of abundance, but seeds of doubt that would later contribute to Germany's post-war transformation. And this was only the beginning. Because the deeper one looks into the records, the more shocking the details become. Not just about the food and the tractors, but about the secret programs, the hidden propaganda wars, and the scandals that erupted inside America's own POW system. If the first shock to German POWs was the abundance of food and machinery, the second was the discovery of America's propaganda war, a campaign as subtle as it was relentless. While the camps looked humane on the surface, every aspect of daily life was carefully designed to undermine Nazi ideology and replace it with something else. The US military called it re-education, though officially it was presented as voluntary. In reality, it was a massive psychological experiment conducted on hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. According to declassified records from the Special Projects Division of the War Department, which was established in 1944, America launched a systematic effort to reshape the thinking of German POWs. It began with books. Each camp had a library, stocked not only with technical manuals and novels, but also with works banned in Nazi Germany. Translations of Mark Twain, John Steinbeck, and Ernest Hemingway were placed alongside German classics. Political works like Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man and Abraham Lincoln's speeches were added deliberately. By the end of the war, the army reported that German POWs had borrowed over 2.5 million books. Then came newspapers. The Americans published a German-language paper called Der Ruf, The Call, edited by anti-Nazi German émigrés. Circulated in dozens of camps, it contained news of the war, essays on democracy, and cultural articles. Historian Matthias Reiss notes in his book, Controlling the Enemy, that while the Americans censored content, they allowed just enough authenticity to make prisoners trust it. The goal was to plant doubt, to show that Hitler was lying, that the war was lost, and that there was another way forward for Germany. Movies were another weapon. Camps routinely screened films, sometimes Hollywood productions, sometimes captured German reels. The contrast was jarring. On one night, prisoners might watch Gone with the Wind, with its scenes of southern mansions. Then the next evening, a US Army documentary showing the devastation of Hamburg after Allied bombing. The message was clear. America had culture, beauty, and limitless wealth, while Germany faced ruin. But perhaps the most powerful propaganda came from direct exposure to ordinary Americans. POWs working on farms encountered families who treated them not as monsters, but as laborers, or even as sons. Farmers in Texas and Nebraska often invited POWs to share meals after a long day in the fields. Letters intercepted by US censors reveal how shocking this was to men raised on Nazi propaganda about Yankee corruption. One soldier wrote, "They eat with us at the same table. This would be unthinkable in Germany with Russians or Poles." The contrast gnawed at prisoners. Back home, the Reich had enslaved millions of foreign workers, forcing them into brutal labor under starvation rations. Yet here, in the enemy's homeland, German soldiers, supposedly the master race, were treated with decency and given wages. It was an inversion of everything Nazi ideology claimed. Not everyone accepted it. In many camps, Nazi diehards continued to exert control. They held secret meetings, smuggled propaganda, and enforced an iron code of silence during interrogations. The US Army's Prisoner of War Information Bureau noted in 1944 that perhaps 10–15% of prisoners were considered fanatical Nazis, while another 25% were committed National Socialists. These men often used intimidation and violence to suppress others. The Tonkawa murder of Johannes Kunze was not an isolated event. At Camp Aiken in South Carolina, prisoners beat a fellow soldier nearly to death for refusing to salute Hitler's portrait. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, a secret Nazi tribunal sentenced men to death for treason. American guards discovered coded messages, illegal radios, and even makeshift swastika banners hidden in barracks. The US response was mixed. On one hand, authorities cracked down on extremist groups, transferring ringleaders to high-security camps like Camp Alva, Oklahoma. On the other, officials quietly encouraged the divide between moderates and hardliners, seeing it as a way to fracture Nazi unity. The Special Projects Division specifically targeted younger prisoners, believing they were more open to re-education. By 1945, evidence suggested it was working. Surveys conducted by the Army revealed that many POWs no longer trusted official German propaganda. Historian Arnold Kramer cites one revealing statistic. By the war's end, over 90% of POWs admitted that Germany would lose. This acceptance was not simply a matter of reading newspapers. It was the lived reality of watching America's factories, highways, and farms in action. Yet beneath the surface, scandals brewed. one of the most explosive, involved labor exploitation. While the Geneva Convention allowed POW labor, it forbade dangerous or humiliating work. But records uncovered in the 1970s revealed that in some states, German POWs were illegally leased to private corporations, including construction companies and logging firms, without proper oversight. Wages meant for the prisoners were sometimes pocketed by contractors. In Louisiana, POWs were used to repair levees under brutal summer conditions. In Mississippi, they were sent into malaria-infested swamps to clear timber. Reports of deaths from heat stroke and accidents were quietly buried. Historian David Fiedler, in The Enemy Among Us, uncovered cases where guards falsified paperwork to hide violations. While most POWs experienced relatively humane treatment, these darker episodes showed that America's system was not free of corruption. There was also the matter of segregation. In 1940s, America, Jim Crow laws still divided black and white citizens. German POWs noticed the hypocrisy immediately. At some camps in the South, they were served in restaurants where black American soldiers could not enter. One German officer reportedly told an interrogator, "You say we are racists, but in your country, a Negro cannot even sit at your table." This contradiction became ammunition for Nazi loyalists inside the camps, who used it to argue that American democracy was a sham. US officials were well aware of the problem but struggled to counter it. Declassified War Department memos show frustration. How could they preach democracy abroad while practicing segregation at home? For the prisoners, these contradictions made America even more complex. On one hand, they saw abundance, kindness, and opportunity. On the other, they saw racial injustice, corruption, and hypocrisy. It was a revelation in both directions. America was not the paradise portrayed in propaganda, but it was undeniably powerful. By 1945, as Germany collapsed, thousands of POWs began to think not just about survival, but about the future. What kind of Germany would they return to? What had they learned in America, and how would it shape them when the Reich was gone? The answers would come in shocking ways. Because as the war ended, the US faced a new problem. What to do with hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers on American soil? And the decisions made in those years, who went home, who stayed, and who secretly worked for the United States, remain some of the most scandalous and least known stories of World War II. By the spring of 1945, with the Third Reich crumbling, the United States faced an unprecedented logistical challenge. It was holding over 370,000 German POWs scattered across the continent. Every day, trains moved thousands between ports, camps, and labor sites. The war was ending, but America had no clear plan for what came next. Repatriation was complicated by politics, by economics, and by one scandal that historians only began uncovering decades later: the quiet transfer of prisoners into secret US government programs. On paper, the Geneva Convention required that all prisoners be returned without delay once hostilities ended. But the War Department dragged its feet. Instead of immediate repatriation, German POWs were kept for months, some for years, after Germany's surrender. The official justification was labor. America's farms and factories still relied heavily on their work, and the army argued that shipping 400,000 men across the Atlantic overnight was impossible. But critics pointed out that Britain, France, and the Soviet Union were demanding the return of their own citizens immediately. Why not the Germans? The truth was more complicated. Declassified War Department memoranda from 1945 reveal discussions about using German POWs as bargaining chips in post-war negotiations. France, devastated by occupation and short on manpower, pressured Washington to transfer tens of thousands of German prisoners directly into French custody. In July 1945, the US complied, shipping more than 30,000 POWs to France where many were forced into hard labor rebuilding roads and clearing mines. Reports emerged of malnutrition, beatings, and deaths, conditions far harsher than in America. Historian Raphael Scheck has documented these transfers as a violation of international law, noting that the US essentially outsourced the dirty work to an ally. Inside America itself, another scandal brewed. Not every prisoner was destined for repatriation. The US intelligence community, already eyeing the Soviet Union as the next adversary, began quietly recruiting among German POWs. Skilled engineers, scientists, and even intelligence officers were offered deals, cooperate, and avoid forced return to Europe. The most famous example was Operation Paperclip, which brought over 1,600 German scientists, some of them former Nazi Party members, into the US aerospace and weapons industries. While most of these men were not POWs in camps, documents show that POW interrogations helped identify candidates. Prisoners with technical expertise were often separated and interviewed intensively by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA. For ordinary POWs, however, life after surrender became a limbo. Camps remained active through late 1945, even as American soldiers themselves demobilized. At Camp Hearn in Texas, prisoners were shocked to learn that they would not be going home immediately, despite Germany's defeat. Letters reveal their frustration. The war is over, but we remain behind barbed wire. Are we still enemies, or are we slaves? The US tried to placate them with more re-education programs. Cultural officers organized lectures on democracy, screened films about the founding fathers, and staged discussions about rebuilding Europe. In some camps, German prisoners were even shown footage from the Nuremberg concentration camps, graphic evidence of Nazi crimes. The goal was to break through denial. According to historian Ron Robin, reactions were mixed. Some prisoners were horrified. Others dismissed the footage as propaganda, but seeds of doubt were planted, especially among the younger men. Yet not all revelations came from films. For many POWs, the most shocking discovery was the treatment of American citizens of German descent. In the Reich, loyalty was enforced with terror. Dissenters were jailed or executed. In the US, by contrast, millions of German Americans lived openly, publishing newspapers, teaching in schools, and even serving in the US Army. For POWs, this contradicted everything Goebbels' propaganda had claimed. They had been told German culture was being destroyed in America. Instead, they saw it thriving. Still, beneath this surface of abundance and decency, darker realities surfaced. A little-known report compiled by the Army Inspector General in 1946 revealed dozens of cases of abuse within US camps. While overall treatment was humane, individual guards sometimes brutalized prisoners, especially those suspected of being Nazi fanatics. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, guards reportedly forced prisoners to crawl on their hands and knees in gravel. At Fort Devens in Massachusetts, prisoners complained of being beaten with rifle butts. Most of these cases were quietly hushed up, never reaching the public record. The issue of race remained explosive. German POWs often received better treatment than Black American soldiers. In some southern towns, white civilians welcomed captured Germans into their restaurants while turning away Black veterans in uniform. Historian Robert Jefferson calls this the great irony of the POW experience. That men who had served Hitler's war machine could access privileges denied to US citizens who had fought for democracy. This contradiction did not go unnoticed by the prisoners, nor by the African American press, which condemned the hypocrisy in editorials. Another scandal came from escape attempts. Despite barbed wire and armed guards, hundreds of German POWs tried to flee. Some succeeded, at least for a time. In 1945, 2 Germans escaped from a camp in Arizona and attempted to cross into Mexico, only to be recaptured weeks later. In Texas, entire work details vanished into the countryside, hiding in barns and trying to blend in as migrant workers. FBI files document more than 2,000 escape attempts nationwide. Most were unsuccessful, but they revealed the vulnerabilities of the camp system. Some escapes ended violently. In August 1944, 2 prisoners fled from Camp Aliceville, Alabama, and murdered a local farmer who confronted them. The incident sparked outrage, fueling calls to tighten security and end soft treatment of Nazis. Newspapers fanned the scandal, questioning why enemy soldiers were allowed relative freedom to work outside camps, while American boys died overseas. The War Department doubled patrols, but the controversy never fully faded. By late 1945, public patience was wearing thin. Families of American servicemen demanded answers. Why were enemy soldiers eating steak in Texas while US troops starved in Japanese prison camps? Why were Germans working on farms while American veterans returned home to unemployment? The pressure mounted on Washington to accelerate repatriation. The first large shipments began in late 1945, when over 140,000 Germans were returned to Europe. But even this was scandalous. Instead of going home, many were handed directly to Britain and France for forced labour. At ports in France, prisoners were marched into mines and quarries under guard. Some never returned. Survivors later testified that they considered this the true beginning of captivity, not their years in America. For those who did eventually return to Germany, the memories of America were unforgettable. They had seen tractors that ploughed faster than entire villages, highways that stretched beyond the horizon, supermarkets stocked with goods their families had not seen in years. They had also seen hypocrisy, racial segregation, and corruption. But above all, they had seen that the Reich's propaganda was a lie. America was not weak. America was overwhelming. And yet, the story does not end with repatriation, because among the hundreds of thousands who returned, a few thousand did not. They had made a choice to stay behind, to work for the US, or to quietly disappear into the fabric of post-war America. And their fates form one of the most secretive chapters of the POW saga. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, German POWs in America expected ships to carry them home within weeks. Instead, for many, a new and even more controversial chapter began. Washington faced a dilemma. It could not simply send 370,000 Germans back to a devastated Europe without creating chaos. But behind this logistical excuse, a quieter truth emerged. Many of those men would not be returned quickly because they were simply too valuable to America. The first layer of this story was manpower. America's wartime economy had depended heavily on POW labor, and the sudden removal of hundreds of thousands of workers risked collapsing key industries. Cotton farmers in Texas petitioned Congress to delay repatriation, insisting their crops would rot without German hands in the fields. In Nebraska, food processors argued that POWs kept meatpacking plants running while veterans were still overseas. Documents in the National Archives reveal dozens of letters from governors pleading with the War Department to hold prisoners through the harvest. The army complied. Even after VE Day, prisoners worked under guard in American agriculture, logging, and road construction. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana, German POWs continued cutting timber until the spring of 1946, nearly a full year after Germany's surrender. The Geneva Convention had been clear. POWs must be released without delay. But delay became a matter of interpretation. and America's interpretation favored its own economy. The second layer was intelligence. US interrogators had already identified prisoners with skills in engineering, chemistry, and rocketry. Instead of sending them back, many were quietly transferred to intelligence centers like Fort Hunt, Virginia, known as P.O. Box 1142. There, German officers, engineers, and U-boat crews were questioned intensively. Some were offered incentives to cooperate, better food, private quarters, or even a chance at resettlement in America. The scandal lay not just in the interrogations, but in the recruitment. By 1946, US intelligence agencies, now turning their gaze toward the Soviet Union, began handpicking Germans for long-term work. Historians Michael Neufeld and Alex Abella have documented how POW interrogations fed directly into Operation Paperclip, which imported over 1,600 German scientists, including Werner von Braun, the rocket engineer who had built the V-2 weapons that terrorized London. While most paperclip recruits were never inside rural POW camps, the prisoner system served as a screening ground, a human catalogue for America's new Cold War arsenal. For the ordinary soldier, however, repatriation was not to America or even to Germany, but often to a third country. Between 1945 and 1946, Washington transferred tens of thousands of German POWs to Britain and France, where labour shortages were crippling. Britain received over 130,000 prisoners from the United States, many of whom worked rebuilding bombed-out cities or clearing unexploded ordnance. France took tens of thousands more. For prisoners, this felt like betrayal. They had endured captivity in America under relatively humane conditions, only to be shipped to coal mines in Lorraine or vineyards in Provence under near-slavery conditions. Letters and diaries later collected by historians paint a grim picture. One former POW, Hans Keller, described arriving in France in 1946. "We had lived well in America. Meat, bread, music. Here we were starved, beaten, and cursed. It was as if captivity began again." Mortality rates in French labour camps were significantly higher than in US facilities, though the French government long denied abuses. Only in the 1980s did official documents confirm that at least 30,000 German POWs died in French custody after the war, many of them men originally captured by Americans. Inside the United States, meanwhile, scandals of another kind broke out. Newspapers began questioning why German prisoners were still eating well while millions of Europeans starved. The American Red Cross warned that Europe faced famine in the winter of 1945-46. Yet POW camps in Alabama and Colorado reported surpluses of food. Public opinion began to shift. A 1946 Gallup poll showed that nearly half of Americans believed German prisoners should be forced into reconstruction work overseas, rather than repatriated immediately. The War Department, sensing the tension, accelerated shipments. By mid-1946, most camps were emptied, but not all prisoners returned to Germany. Some, particularly those who had cooperated with American intelligence or expressed anti-Nazi views, were quietly resettled. A small number married American women they had met while working on farms and petitioned to stay. Officially, this was forbidden. Unofficially, local communities sometimes lobbied on their behalf. Then came the third layer, propaganda after captivity. As prisoners returned to Germany, US officials launched programs to ensure they carried more than just memories. They carried ideas. The re-education campaigns continued on ships crossing the Atlantic. According to historian Matthias Reiss, the army distributed thousands of pamphlets on democracy, economics, and the rebuilding of Europe. Films were shown during voyages, depicting Germany's destruction under Hitler and the promise of reconstruction with American aid. This was no accident. By 1946, the US was already preparing the ground for what would become the Marshall Plan. The return of German POWs was part of this larger geopolitical strategy. Men who had seen America's abundance firsthand were expected to become voices of moderation, even advocates for partnership with the West. For some, it worked. Many former POWs later admitted that their years in America profoundly changed them. They had seen supermarkets, highways, and machines that Germany could only dream of. They had experienced freedom of religion, uncensored libraries, and even kindness from civilians. Returning to bombed-out German cities, they contrasted the ruins of the Reich with the order of American life. One former POW recalled in 1947, "We came home not just defeated, but educated. We had seen the future, and it was not German, it was American." Yet others returned embittered. They had been deceived by promises of quick release, shipped off to French mines, or interrogated endlessly by American intelligence. For them, captivity symbolized exploitation. This dual legacy, gratitude in some, resentment in others, shaped post-war Germany in ways rarely acknowledged. The scandal was not just about delayed repatriation, but about what it revealed: that America's POW system was never simply about containment. It was about labor, intelligence, propaganda, and power. And the consequences of those choices rippled far beyond the camps. Because as the Cold War dawned, the knowledge, the loyalties, and the memories of those German POWs would become weapons in a new struggle. Some would help build rockets that carried men to the moon. Others would warn their children of betrayal at American hands. And in the middle lay the uncomfortable truth: that captivity in America was never just captivity. It was part of a grander design. By 1946, most German POW camps in the United States were emptying, their barbed wire fences abandoned, their barracks falling silent. But the legacy of those camps was only beginning to unfold, because the men who had lived behind those fences, over 370,000 of them, returned to a Germany that was itself a prisoner, divided, starving, and occupied. And the impact of what they had seen in America would play out in ways that neither Washington nor Berlin had anticipated. The first shock for returning POWs was the contrast. They left camps where food had been plentiful and housing solid, and came back to a Germany of rubble and ration cards. US Army records show that in 1946, the average German civilian received just 1,200 calories per day, less than what prisoners had eaten in American custody. Some ex-POWs described the bitter irony of being healthier upon release than their own families at home. Historian Matthias Reis notes that returning soldiers often faced resentment. Civilians accused them of eating well in America, while their children starved in bombed-out cities. This resentment created a social rift. For some ex-prisoners, it turned into guilt. For others, into pride. They became walking testaments to the enemy's strength. In villages across Bavaria, Württemberg, and the Rhineland, ex-POWs told stories of tractors that ploughed endlessly, of factories that never lacked steel, of highways without bomb craters. These stories spread rapidly, undermining years of Nazi propaganda. Goebbels had painted America as weak and decadent, but these men had lived inside its machine. They knew the truth. America's wealth and production were beyond anything the Reich had imagined. But their return also exposed the darker side of captivity. Thousands of men had not come back from American custody at all, but had instead been diverted to France or Britain, where forced labor continued for years. In Germany, these stories circulated quickly, often distorted by rumor. Survivors spoke of beatings in French mines, starvation in British work camps, and men who never returned. While the US government tried to frame these transfers as necessary reparations, for many Germans they looked like betrayal. The scandal deepened with revelations of secret recruitment. As the Cold War began, stories leaked of German officers who had vanished from POW lists and reappeared in the United States working for the military. The best known were scientists tied to Operation Paperclip, but there were also intelligence officers quietly funneled into American service. Declassified CIA records confirm that former Wehrmacht officers were recruited to gather intelligence on Soviet troop movements in Eastern Europe. Some of these men had once commanded units accused of atrocities, yet were now working for the very country that had defeated them. This revelation created outrage when it finally surfaced decades later. Families of Holocaust victims demanded to know why Nazi officials had been sheltered rather than prosecuted. The US government maintained that the Cold War required pragmatism. Soviet expansion was the greater threat, and expertise could not be wasted. But for many Germans, the scandal reinforced the sense that their captivity had not been about justice. It had been about power. For those who had simply lived in the camps, however, the most enduring memory was cultural. Many ex-POWs described America not as an enemy, but as an education. They had learned English, discovered jazz music, read American novels, and debated politics freely in camp classrooms. Some described it as their second university. When they returned to Germany, these men became teachers, journalists, and politicians. A study conducted in West Germany in the 1950s found that former POWs were disproportionately represented in professions tied to education and media. This was not coincidence. US re-education programs had aimed precisely at creating future voices of democracy. Historian Jürgen Heideking argued that the POW experience in America helped lay the groundwork for West Germany's democratic culture in the 1950s. Men who had seen American abundance and freedom were more willing to embrace the Marshall Plan, NATO, and integration with the West. But there was also bitterness. For POWs who had been shipped to France or Britain, or held longer than expected, captivity bred resentment. East German propaganda exploited this ruthlessly. In the Soviet zone, newspapers portrayed America's POW camps as exploitative, focusing on the transfers to forced labor abroad. Former prisoners were paraded as witnesses to alleged abuse, their testimonies twisted to fit the communist narrative. The irony was stark. Men who had lived in America's relatively humane camps were used by East German propagandists to discredit the United States. Meanwhile, in the United States itself, the story of the POWs largely vanished from public memory. Camps were dismantled, farmland reclaimed, barracks sold as scrap. Few Americans spoke of the time when Nazi soldiers harvested their cotton or fixed their roads. For decades, the topic was buried, overshadowed by the triumphalist narrative of victory in World War II. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s that historians began to dig into the archives, uncovering the complexities and scandals of the POW system. Arnold Kramer's Nazi Prisoners of War in America, 1979, revealed the sheer scale of the program. David Fiedler's research exposed the illegal leasing of POW labor. Declassified documents exposed the intelligence recruitment networks. Only then did the public begin to grasp that this had been more than captivity. It had been a quiet battlefield of propaganda, economics, and geopolitics. And, perhaps the most lasting irony was this: German POWs in America were often treated better than many Americans themselves. In the Jim Crow South, they dined in restaurants off-limits to black citizens. On farms, they were given wages that sometimes exceeded what migrant workers earned. In camps, they had libraries and orchestras, while Japanese Americans, loyal US citizens, languished in internment camps with far fewer resources. The contradiction was glaring, and it remains one of the most uncomfortable truths of World War II. By 1947, nearly all prisoners had been repatriated, but their memories, their testimonies, and their experiences could not be erased. Some carried admiration for America into their families, influencing a generation of West Germans who embraced democracy and consumer culture. Others carried resentment, fueling narratives of betrayal and exploitation. Together, they left behind a legacy that was far more complicated than victory parades and treaties. And yet, even this is not the full story. Because hidden in archives and intelligence files are tales of the men who never went back at all. Men who disappeared from the records, absorbed into America's Cold War machine. Their stories form the final, secretive chapter of the German POW saga. For most German POWs, the war ended with a ship ride back across the Atlantic, a train to their ruined hometowns, and a slow return to civilian life. But not for everyone. A shadowy minority never went home at all. They slipped the frame through the cracks of the prisoner system, vanishing into America's intelligence networks, research laboratories, and Cold War front lines. And their disappearance remains one of the most scandalous, least acknowledged aspects of the entire POW saga. The trail begins at Fort Hunt, Virginia, better known by its wartime codename, P.O. Box 1142. Officially, it was just an interrogation site. In reality, it was one of the most secret facilities in the United States. Here, hundreds of high-value German prisoners, U-boat captains, rocket engineers, intelligence officers were questioned relentlessly. Declassified Army intelligence files show that many of these men were never returned to standard POW camps. Some were held in near-luxury conditions, given good food and private rooms, in exchange for cooperation. From Fort Hunt, a select few were funneled into classified programs. The most infamous was Operation Paperclip, which recruited German scientists to work for the United States. Names like Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and Kurt Debus, men who had once worked for Hitler's rocket program, were brought to America to build the next generation of missiles and space technology. They were not treated as prisoners, but as assets. Von Braun would go on to design the Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon. Yet, in Germany, many remembered him as the man who had overseen slave labour at Mittelwerk, where thousands of concentration camp inmates died producing V-2 rockets. But Paperclip was only the most visible example. Less known were intelligence operations that recruited former Wehrmacht and Abwehr officers. In 1946, the US helped establish the Gehlen Organization, led by Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's former chief of intelligence on the Eastern Front. Using networks of former German officers, Gehlen built a spy ring for the United States focused on the Soviet Union. Many of his recruits were ex-POWs identified during interrogations. By the early 1950s, the Gehlen Organization became the backbone of West Germany's new intelligence service, the BND. This meant that men who had once fought ferociously for Hitler were now working for Washington, sometimes with little accountability for their wartime actions. Historians like Christopher Simpson, in his book Blowback, argue that this recruitment compromised American ideals. Instead of prosecuting war criminals, the US had recycled them as Cold War tools. Meanwhile, on a smaller scale, dozens of former POWs simply melted into American life. Farmers in Texas, Nebraska, and Minnesota petitioned local authorities to let their Germans stay. Some prisoners had fallen in love with local women, secretly marrying after the war. Officially, the War Department forbade POWs from settling permanently. Unofficially, a handful never left. Immigration records uncovered in the 1990s show cases of ex-POWs re-entering the US under civilian visas in the late 1940s, sponsored by American families who had first employed them under guard. Then there were the disappearances, the men whose files simply ended. Declassified FBI reports mention missing POWs who escaped from camps and were never recaptured. Some may have fled across the Mexican border. Others may have blended into German-American communities in the Midwest. Their numbers were small, but their stories remain buried in dusty case files. The scandal of these vanishings was twofold. First, they highlighted the flaws of a system that had prided itself on order and control. Second, they raised uncomfortable questions. How many Nazis had been quietly absorbed into American society? And at what cost to justice? For Germany, the return, or non-return, of POWs shaped post-war politics for decades. In West Germany, ex-POWs became a crucial part of Reconstruction. Their first-hand knowledge of America made them natural allies in the Marshall Plan era. They had seen democracy, consumer abundance, and technological power, and many helped steer West Germany toward the Western Alliance. In East Germany, however, returning prisoners were often treated with suspicion, accused of being infected with American ideas. The Soviets, who held their own brutal network of POW camps, used the contrast to paint America as manipulative, its kindness nothing but propaganda. In the United States, the memory of the POWs faded quickly. Camps were dismantled, barracks sold off, farmland reclaimed. By the 1950s, few Americans remembered that hundreds of thousands of Nazis had lived among them, harvesting cotton, felling trees, and repairing roads. The story was inconvenient, awkward, and easily forgotten. Only decades later did the fuller picture emerge, through declassified documents, memoirs, and the work of historians. They revealed a paradox. German POWs in America had often been treated better than America's own minorities. They had been better fed than German civilians. They had been safer than Allied prisoners in Nazi camps. And yet, they had also been pawns, exploited for labor, manipulated with propaganda, and selectively siphoned into secret Cold War programs. The legacy of their captivity is therefore a story of contradictions. It is a story of abundance and exploitation, of kindness and hypocrisy, of opportunity and betrayal. It is a story that shows how even in victory, democracies can bend the rules when power is at stake. When German POWs first arrived in America, they were stunned by the tractors, the highways, the endless cigarettes, and the food piled high on tables. They thought they were seeing the future. In many ways, they were. But the real shock, the part never shown in propaganda reels or wartime newspapers, was how that future would use them, reshape them, and in some cases, erase them entirely. And so, the barbed wire camps of America were more than just holding pens for defeated soldiers. They were laboratories of propaganda, tools of economic survival, and gateways into a new global struggle. For the men who lived there, they were both a prison and a window into another world. For the nations that built them, they were proof that even in war and in victory, morality was never absolute.